Okay, so let's get started with this project. Vegan ignorance is bliss, but really, is it? Let's delve deeper into this because everything he says is easily debunked and is emotion-based statements. There's no logic, there's no fact-checking, there's no logical coherence to it. Right at the start, notice what's happening. Veganism is framed as an emotional identity, loving animals, before the argument is made.
Oh, I knew that. Yeah, I did know that. Yeah.
And the reason I do is because I love animals.
Yeah, of course.
And you've and you
This matters because once you frame something as sentimental, you don't have to engage with it seriously. This isn't evidence, it's tone setting, and it primes the audience to treat vegan ethics as naive before facts appear. Before we even get into the claims, I want to pause on how this conversation starts, because the framing here does a lot of work quietly. Veganism is introduced as something emotional. You love animals, you're kind, you care. That sounds positive, but it's not neutral. Framing something as emotional immediately lowers its epistemic status. It suggests sentiment instead of reasoning, feeling instead of analysis, which is exactly what Carnivore does. He uses sentiment instead of reasoning. This is important because veganism as an ethical position is not built on vibes, it's built on a very simple question. Given the options available to us, which choices cause less unnecessary harm? But notice how that question never gets asked. Instead, veganism is subtly reframed as a kind of a naive compassion, almost childlike, as if the motivation is I love animals rather than I've evaluated the outcome. That matters because once you successfully frame a position as emotional, you don't actually have to refute it. You just have to sound tougher than it is, more realistic, more worldly. This is a classic straw man, but not the obvious kind where someone invents a ridiculous claim. It's a toned straw man. Veganism isn't misrepresented in content yet. It's misrepresented in character. The implication is vegans mean well, but they don't understand how the real world works. And once that assumption is planted, every later criticism sounds reasonable, even when it isn't. Ask yourself this as you're watching. Are they engaging with the argument for vegan ethics, or are they engaging with a personality they've invented? Because those are not the same thing. Once veganism is framed as emotional and naive, the next step is predictable. You introduce a big, scary system problem like monocropping and quietly imply that veganism caused it. That's where the first major factual error comes in.
Oh, I knew that. Yeah, I did know that. Yeah.
and the reason I do is because I love animals.
Yeah, of course.
And you famously do.
You'd think to love animals, you would love nature.
Then you've got monocropping, which is just not natural. So all the animals are displaced. All of the natural habitat is taken up, all the trees, all the bush.
So here they're arguing for perfection. Veganism isn't about perfection. It's about reducing harm where possible. It's unavoidable. Monocropping is unavoidable. And not only that, but most crops go to feed the animals, not people. So they're arguing against their own point without even being self-aware of it. Here's the first major mistake. Monocropping is a feature of industrial agriculture, not vegan ethics. Blaming veganism for monocropping is like blaming public transport for traffic. The question isn't, does monocropping cause harm? It does. The question is, which food system requires the most of it? And that answer is animal agriculture. Most crops go to animal agriculture. He's arguing against his own point without being self-aware of it. This is where the conversation shifts from tone to claims. The word monocropping gets introduced, and it sounds serious, scientific. It immediately raises images of destroyed ecosystems, displaced animal, and poisoned soil. And here's the more subtle move. Monocropping is talking about as if it's a consequence of veganism. But monocropping has nothing to do with vegan ethics. Monocropping is a feature of industrial agriculture, regardless of what's being grown. The distinction matters. Veganism is a consumer-level ethical stance. Monocropping is production-level economic decision driven by scale, profit, and efficiency. You create monocropping by designing an agricultural system that prioritizes yield and uniformity over resilience. Here's the context that's completely absent from the video. Most monocrop plants are not grown to feed vegans. They're grown to feed animals. Soy, corn, wheat. The majority of these crops go to livestock feed, not tofu, not oat milk, not lentils. The arithmetic they avoid. This isn't ideology, it's arithmetic. When you eat animals, you're not skipping monocropping, you're adding an extra step, one that requires more land, more crops, and more monocropping. So if monocropping is the concern, and it should be, then eating animals intensifies the very harm being described. This is why this section fails ethically. It takes a systemic harm and pins it on individual ethical choice incorrectly. That's false causality. Veganism didn't create monocropping, industrial agriculture did. Now, to be clear, this isn't a defense of industrial plant farming. Monocropping is destructive. Pesticide-heavy agriculture is destructive. But those harms don't disappear when animals enter the picture. They multiply. And once monocropping is misattributed to veganism, the next move is predictable. Start listing the animals harmed by pesticides without ever asking which food system causes more of it. So, yeah, their diet contributes more to pesticides and all of that than veganism does. They have no idea what they're talking about.
Is to destroy an ecosystem, to grow one crop where you have to, keep all of the pests away using pesticides. We're killing birds and bugs, and that affects the entire food chain.
1 point.
So this is where selective concern kicks in. Insects, birds, rodents, suddenly they matter only when plants are involved. But the same pesticides are used in greater quantities to grow feed for livestock. So if this was really about ecosystems, the argument would point in the opposite direction. Now the argument escalates. We move from monocropping as a system problem to a vivid list of casualties: birds, frogs, bugs, toads, bees, and butterflies. The goal here isn't explanation, it's emotional saturation. Notice what's happening. Harm is being made visible, but only in one direction. The deaths caused by pesticides are attributed implicitly to plant-based food, while the same harms caused upstream by animal agriculture are left out of frame. This is selective harm visibility. You spotlight the deaths that support your conclusion and ignore the larger set of deaths that contradict it. Pesticides are not unique to crops grown for direct human consumption. They are used extensively, often more intensively, on crops grown to feed livestock. Corn, soy, alfalfa, the same chemicals, the same ecological effects on a larger scale. So when someone lists insects and animals killed by pesticides and treats that as an argument against veganism, they're skipping the most important question. Which food system requires more pesticide-treated crops overall? The answer is not plant-based diets, it's animal agriculture. Because feeding animals requires growing more plants than feeding humans directly. This isn't a disagreement about whether pesticides cause harm. They do. The ethical failure is pretending that harm only counts when it can be rhetorically pinned on veganism. If insects and birds matter morally, then systems that minimize total land use, total crop volume, and total chemical input matter too. Selective concern isn't ethics, it's narrative control. Ask yourself, are they trying to reduce harm, or are they trying to make one group of people feel responsible for harm while excusing a larger source of it? Because those are very different goals. It's like blaming someone that murdered in self-defense while you yourself are a serial killer. It's like a serial killer bastardizing someone because they killed someone in self-defense. Once the harm is emotionally loaded, the next move is to raise the bar impossibly high. To say, if harm still exists at all, then trying to reduce it is meaningless. That's where absolutism enters the picture. Also, appeal to futility fallacy. Well, if it can't be perfect, then we shouldn't do anything, right? If we can't stop rape at all, then we shouldn't do anything about rape.
To grow one crop where you have to, keep all of the pests.
We've started talking about charity, and I absolutely agree with that. But they're conflating being vegan with looking after animals.
That's why they go vegan. They think that that's the best way to care for animals.
Because of your success, you felt like do you feel like you had a moral obligation to do something like that?
I've always done it. It is a moral obligation, isn't it, to be kind to animals?
This is the ethical sleight of hand. Veganism is treated as if it claims moral purity. It doesn't. Vegan ethics is about reducing avoidable harm, not eliminating harm entirely. Demanding perfection is a way to avoid responsibility. Here's where the argument quietly shifts its rules. Up till now, harm has been described. Now harm is used as a veto. The implication becomes simple. If animals are harmed anywhere in the process, then choosing to reduce harm anywhere is pointless. This is absolutism. It treats ethics as an all or nothing game. Either your actions cause zero harm or your actions don't count at all. But that isn't how ethics works, and it isn't how we reason about harm in any other domain. Medicine causes harm. Surgery kills cells. Driving causes accidents. Housing destroys habitats. None of that leads us to conclude that trying to reduce harm is meaningless, yet that is exactly the standard being applied here, selectively. Veganism is not the claim that no animals are ever harmed, it's the claim that avoidable harm matters, that reducing harm, even imperfectly, is ethical relevant. Absolutism erases that distinction. It collapses the difference between Harm you cannot reasonably avoid and harm you actively choose.
They've started talking about charity, and I absolutely agree with that. But they're conflating being vegan with looking after animals.
That's why they go vegan. They think that that's the best way to care for animals.
This move is powerful because it feels sophisticated. It sounds like realism, but it actually shuts down ethics entirely. If no action is valid unless it is perfect, then no ethical progress is ever possible. That standard doesn't lead to honesty, it leads to resignation. Ask yourself, do they apply this standard everywhere, or only when it conveniently dismisses a position they don't want to engage with? Because ethics that only appear when they excuse harm aren't ethics at all. Once absolutism is established, the next step is easy. You point to unavoidable harm and treat it as proof that intentional harm doesn't matter. That's where the animals die to protect crops argument comes in.
Because of your success, you felt like do you feel like you had a moral obligation to do something like that?
I've always done it. It is a moral obligation, isn't it, to be kind to animals and everything else.
Animals are killed to protect fruit, to protect plants. I mean, this is common knowledge. That's what a pesticide is.
And
Yes, animals die in crop production. That's not a revelation. What's missing is proportionality. Eating animals requires more crops, not fewer. So this argument doesn't refute veganism, it reinforces it. They're arguing against their own position again. This is where absolutism gets operationalized. A factual statement is introduced. Animals die during crop production. The statement is true, and then immediately it's misused. The existence of harm is treated as proof that efforts to reduce harm are meaningless. This is the perfection fallacy. It assumes that if a solution isn't total, it isn't a solution at all. But ethics does not ask whether harm exists, it asks whether harm can be reduced. Saying animals die to protect crops does not refute vegan ethics. It raises comparative question. Compared to what? Compared to diets that require more land, crops, pesticide use, and more habitat destruction. Feeding animals requires growing plants first, and then growing more plants to reduce the calories lost in conversion. So the relevant question isn't, do animals ever die in plant agriculture? The relevant question is, which food system causes more of those deaths overall? The argument stops before the arithmetic matters. It names harm and then refuses to compare scale. That refusal is not caution, it's evasion. When harm is unavoidable, proportionality becomes ethically central. Ignoring proportionality while invoking harm is not moral seriousness, it's moral theater. Ask yourself, are they asking which option causes less harm, or are they using the existence of harm to excuse any amount of it? Those are exact opposite ethical positions. Once harm is declared inevitable, the next rhetorical step is predictable. You stop talking about systems and start talking about what vegans supposedly care about. That's where the claim vegans don't care about bees enters. Vegans don't care about bees.
of course, there are deleterious downstream effects from using.
We lose bees, but obviously they don't care about bees. They don't care about butterflies. They don't care about moths.
Yeah, they do prove they don't. This isn't evidence, it's accusation by tone. Vegans are actually more likely to oppose pesticide use, support organic farming, and reject honey precisely because of bee exploitation, if possible. Saying they don't care is easier than engaging with what they actually argue. This is where the argument stops pretending to be analytical, and instead of addressing systems or outcomes, it pivots to character accusation. The claim becomes vegans don't care about bees. That's not an argument, it's projection. Moral projection works by assigning indifference to others in order to excuse your own position from scrutiny. No evidence is given, no engagement with what vegans actually argue, just an assertion about inner motivation. And it's a especially strange accusation because vegans overwhelmingly oppose pesticide-heavy agriculture, habitat destruction, and industrial pollinator collapse. Many vegans don't consume honey precisely because of concerns about bee exploitation. So this isn't ignorance, it's erasure. Although it is ignorant. Moral projection replaces disagreement with mind reading. Instead of saying, I think this approach is wrong, it says, you don't really care. Once motives are attacked, evidence becomes irrelevant. You can always dismiss a position by claiming the person holding it is insincere. That's not ethics, that's social invalidation. Ask yourself, are they responding to what vegans say and do, or to a version of vegans that exist only to be dismissed? Because accusing people of apathy is easier than engaging with outcomes. That's basic humane sentimentalism. Once motives are questioned, the next move is to question credibility itself, not the claim, but the person making it. That's where how long have you been vegan line comes in.
we lose bees, but obviously they don't care about bees, they don't care about butterflies, they don't care about moths, they don't care about beetles, they don't care about ladybirds, because all of these are killed by pesticides.
What about
So how long have you been vegan for?
I think 2020.
That just makes no sense.
Why? There's no time gate to being vegan, technically. Now watch the move. Instead of addressing claims, the focus shifts on how long someone's been vegan. Ethics doesn't work on seniority. You don't disprove an argument by questioning someone's timeline. At this point, the focus shifts again, not to evidence, not to outcomes, but to tenure. The question isn't framed as hostile, it's casual, almost friendly. How long have you been vegan? This ad hominem softened by tone doesn't attack directly, it undermines quietly. The implication is subtle. Your position is provisional, your understanding is incomplete, and your ethics haven't matured yet. But ethical claims don't gain or lose validity based on how long someone has held them. You don't invalidate an argument about climate change by asking how long someone's believed in it. You don't dismiss a medical claim by asking when someone first learned anatomy, and you don't refute an ethical position by timing it. The move replaces engagement with hierarchy. It suggests that ethics is something you can earn through duration rather than reasoning. But ethics isn't a seniority system, it's an evaluative process. Either a claim holds up or it doesn't. Asking how long someone's believed something avoids answering whether it's true. Ask yourself, does the length of time someone holds a belief change the consequences of their action, or does it just make dismissal easier? Once credibility has been subtly weakened, the next move is to look for inconsistency, to scan for impurity. That's where the plain food and exotic fruit moment comes in.
Right. And how
Yeah.
are you finding that?
For the health of our planet and to save the environment. Oh, look, that's probably my exotic fruit on its way now.
This is the hypocrisy trap. If someone isn't perfectly consistent, their ethics are dismissed entirely. It's absolutism. But ethics isn't aesthetic. Reducing harm imperfectly is still reduction. This is where the argument shifts from ethics to surveillance. Attention moves away from systems and onto personal consistency. For an example, it would be someone arguing, it's like arguing someone against murder because murder is unstoppable, right? Well, people are just going to murder people, so what's the point, right? If you can't eliminate murder completely, then you shouldn't eliminate it by any means necessary, by any reduction, by any example of reduction. A small detail is highlighted. Food on a plane, bread with milk, exotic fruit. The implication is simple. If you aren't perfectly consistent, your ethical position collapses. This is purity framing. It treats ethics as performance rather than evaluation of outcomes. The standard being applied isn't, does the choice reduce harm overall? The standard is, can I find any instance of imperfection? But no ethical position survives that test. Not environmentalism, not human rights, and not public health. People who oppose sweatshops still wear mass-produced clothes. People who oppose fossil fuels still use electricity. That doesn't negate the ethics, it reflects constraint. Purity framing confuses inconsistency with hypocrisy, and hypocrisy with invalidity. It assumes that unless a person can escape the system entirely, they have no standing to criticize it, perfectionism. But ethics under constraint isn't still ethics. Choosing the less harmful option does not require living outside modern infrastructure. Ask yourself, are they evaluating the impact of choices or searching for reasons to dismiss the person making them? Because those lead to very different conclusions. Once purity becomes the standard, the next step is to erase intention entirely. To say that harm you cannot avoid is no different from harm that you actively choose. That's where the control argument enters.
For the health of our planet.
Which is ironic because they're trying to control the narrative instead of actually doing a debunking video, like an actual analysis and breakdown, like I am.
Case. Honestly, if you're in control,
Control.
I think it's easy.
Well, I've just stepped out to meet some food growers, and they have confirmed that control is the word they use to describe the baiting and trapping and killing of animals to protect crops.
And I did it quite gradually. As I went veggie.
This is a crucial distinction. There's a difference between unavoidable harm and intentional exploitation. Veganism opposes the latter. Collapsing the two makes ethics impossible. This is where the argument collapses two very different kinds of harm and pretends they are the same. The word control is introduced: trapping, killing, protecting crops, and the implication follows. If animals die to protect crops, then killing animals for food is ethically equivalent. The equivalence does not hold. There's a fundamental difference between harm that is unavoidable within a system and harm that is the point of the system. Crop protection exists because humans need to eat. Animal exploitation exists because animals are being used as food. One is collateral harm under constraint, the other is intentional harm by design. Treating those as morally identical erases intention, agency, and choice. False equivalence works by flattening distinctions. Once everything is the same, nothing can be judged. If unavoidable harm equals deliberate harm, then ethics becomes impossible. There would be no moral difference between accidental injury and assault and unavoidable risk and chosen violence. But we make these distinctions everywhere else. Here they are just suddenly declared meaningless. Ask yourself, are they distinguishing between harm that must be managed and harm that is actively sought? Or are they collapsing that distinction because it protects the outcome they prefer? They're controlling the narrative. Once intention is erased, the conversation shifts away from systems entirely. It turns inward, towards cravings, desire, and what people like to eat. That's where the cheese segment comes in.
Case. Honestly,
What are the odds that his favourite food would be an animal product? I wonder why that is.
Cheese is, I mean, I've talked about this endlessly.
yeah,
They've not, I don't believe they've managed to replicate
they're
it.
getting better.
73% of plant-based consumers wish there was a better vegan cheese.
So this is humane sentimentalism, as of course the whole video is sentimentalism. It's not logical, rational, or reasonable. Craving something doesn't justify it ethically. The brain craving cheese tells us about neurochemistry, not morality. Desire is not a defense. This is where the segment abandons ethics altogether and retreats into appetite. The focus shifts to cheese, how good it tastes, how hard it is to give up, and how much people miss it. Desire is presented as evidence. The implication is clear. If something is hard to give up, it must be justified. This is biological determinism. It treats cravings as moral facts, but cravings are not ethical arguments. They are neurological responses. Humans crave sugar, humans crave alcohol, humans crave nicotine. None of that tells us whether indulging these cravings is ethically defensible. Also, cheese is as addictive as cocaine. So maybe it's because of the neurochemistry, cheese is addictive. Maybe that's just the answer. Cheese is addictive. This move reframes difficulty as impossibility, and impossibility as excuse. It ignores the very sacrifice that they're admitting. They're sacrificing their taste buds for something moral. The fact that something is pleasurable does not mean it is necessary, and the fact that giving something up is uncomfortable does not mean it is unreasonable. Ethics often requires discomfort. If it didn't, it wouldn't constrain anything. Ask yourself, are they explaining why harm is unavoidable or why they don't want to change? Those are two very different explanations. Once desire is normalized as justification, the next step is to present the body itself as the authority. That's where the line, the body says don't quit cheese, appears.
What are the odds that his favourite,
Extra strong cheddar.
the body's like, please don't quit the cheese?
Addiction signals are reframed as biological wisdom. This logic would justify anything humans become dependent on. It's not an argument, it's rationalization. This is where desire gets rebranded as wisdom. The body is treated as an authority. Craving is no longer just craving, it becomes instruction. The implication is, if the body wants something, resisting it is unnatural. This is naturalization bias. It takes biological response and treats it as a moral guidance. But bodies want many things that we routinely override. Sleep deprivation makes the body crave sugar. Stress makes the body crave alcohol. Addiction makes the body demand reinforcement. We do not treat these signals as ethical mandates. Naturalization bias collapses distinction between explanation and justification. Biology can explain why something feels difficult. It cannot tell us whether indulging that difficulty is ethically defensible. If bodily desire were a moral authority, there would be no bias for restraint, responsibility, or reflection. Ethics would reduce to impulse. Ask yourself, are they using biology to understand behavior or to excuse it? Because those are not the same move. Once bodily desire is elevated to authority, the conversation turns back outward, not to ethics but to taste. That's where mock meat enters the discussion.
extra strong cheddar,
The body's like, please don't quit the cheese.
right? In a
What they're tasting is the bread and the mustard and the ketchup.
they can't really tell the difference.
Yeah.
And that's why people use those condiments, because they do disguise the poor quality meat.
You know, I defy. They're so good now that I have a really good plant burger now.
Personally, if I was going vegan, I would just embrace what it is to be a
Here, ethics is reduced to taste. Whether something tastes the same has nothing to do whether harm was reduced. This is distraction. At this point, ethics is no longer the subject. Sensation is. The discussion turns to taste, condiments, texture, whether you can tell the difference. Harm disappears from the frame. Pleasure takes its place. This is aesthetic reductionism. It reduces ethical questions to matters of sensory preference. The implication becomes if something doesn't taste identical, it isn't worth doing. But ethics is not a flavor test. Whether food tastes the same tells us nothing about how much land was used, how many animals were harmed, or how much environmental damage occurred. Taste is orthogonal to outcome. Also, taste isn't a will. It's not a preference. It's the same as music. You either like it or you don't. You don't just change your preference. You don't overwrite biology. Aesthetic reductionism works by shrinking the frame. It asks the smallest possible question so larger questions disappear. Instead of asking, does this reduce harm, it asks, does this satisfy me the same way? Those are not interchangeable standards. If someone enjoyed murder, they would logically articulate that they're for murder because it makes people happy. It gives sensational pride. Ask yourself, are they evaluating consequences or defeating preference? Because preference does not scale into ethics. Once taste is treated as a metric, the next move is to attack the food itself, not for what it does, but for what it supposedly is. That's where Frankenfood claim appears. Just graze.
What they're tasting is the bread.
Personally, if I was going vegan, I would just embrace what it is to be a herbivore, graze all day long and stop trying to consume the mock meats.
And
This is absolutism. This demands an impossible standard. Veganism isn't about returning to some imagined pre-human purity. It's about making better choices within reality, as in what's actually plausible, what's practicable. This is where the argument drifts into fantasy. An image is introduced. Humans grazing, eating simply, living naturally. It sounds reasonable at first, almost pastoral, but it isn't a proposal, it's a disqualifier. The implication is, unless veganism looks like an imagined pre-industrial purity, it doesn't count. This is absolutism returning in a new form, not just zero harm, but idealized harmlessness. Veganism no longer judged against reality, is judged against a myth. Humans do not live in conditions where grazing is possible. We live in dense globalized societies with infrastructure, supply chains, and constraints. Ethics operates inside those constraints, not outside them. Impossible standards are a way of refusing engagement. If the bar is set somewhere no one can reach, everyone fails by default. That doesn't reveal hypocrisy, it reveals avoidance and control. Demanding that ethics looks pure before it can matter guarantees that ethics never matters. Ask yourself, are they proposing a workable alternative or inventing a standard no one can meet? Because one of those advances understanding, the other is just controlling the narrative. Once an impossible ideal has been set, the next move is to label everything short of it as artificial. That's where Frankenfood claim comes in.
Personally, if I was going vegan, I would just embrace what it is to.
how is that not chicken?
Frankenfoods.
You know, but it's great because it's guilt free.
No diet is guilt free. No plate of food is guilt free. Absolutely not. Every single morsel of food you eat meant that organisms had to die.
It's only
This is a naturalistic fallacy. Artificial doesn't mean harmful. Natural doesn't mean good. Cyanide is natural. Vaccines are artificial. Outcomes matter, not vibes. This is where the language does most of the work. The food isn't criticized for its outcomes, it's criticized for its vibe. The word artificial is invoked, Frankenfood, synthetic, chemically produced. The implication is immediate. If something is artificial, it must be harmful. This is a naturalistic fallacy. It assumes that natural equals good and artificial equals bad. But nature is not a moral guide. Poison is natural. Disease is natural. Parasites are natural. Vaccines are artificial. Clean water systems are artificial. Modern medicine is artificial. Outcomes matter. Origins do not determine ethics. The naturalistic fallacy bypasses evaluation. It replaces evidence with instinct. Instead of asking, does this reduce harm, it asks, does this feel wrong? Feeling wrong is not the same as being wrong. Ethics cannot be grounded in gut reaction alone. Ask yourself, are they explaining what the harm is, or are they just pointing at something unfamiliar? Because unfamiliarity is not an argument. Once artificiality is treated as a moral flaw, the argument reaches its emotional endpoint. The claim that no choice is guilt-free, that nothing matters anyways. That's where the purity collapse happens.
How is that not? Because it's guilt free.
No diet is guilt-free. No plate of food is guilt-free. Absolutely not. Every single morsel of food you eat meant that organisms had to die.
This is the emotional endpoint of absolutism. If no action is pure, then no action matters. That's not ethics, it's resignation. This is the emotional crescendo of the argument. Everything collapses into inevitability. The claim is simple. Every meal causes death, therefore guilt is meaningless. This is purity framing taken to its endpoint. If no action is pure, then no action is ethically distinct. Harm becomes background noise. Choice becomes irrelevant. This is not a neutral observation. It is a conclusion designed to shut ethics down, to avoid rational reasoning. Ethics does not require innocent, it requires discrimination. The ability to distinguish between less harm and more harm, unavoidable harm and chosen harm, mitigation and indifference. Saying no plate is guilt-free is not an argument against ethical choice, it's an argument against caring. Purity framing erases gradients. It treats harm as binary, present or absent. But moral reasoning depends on degree. Without degrees, responsibility disappears. If all outcomes are equally tainted, then there's no reason to prefer one over the other. That position does not lead to honesty, it leads to apathy. Ask yourself, are they acknowledging harm in order to reduce it or invoking harm in order to excuse it? These motives lead to opposite directions. It's like someone saying, well, it's okay that I murdered someone. They're serial killers. They murder more people than I do, so what does it matter if I murder one? Once guilt is declared meaningless, the argument pivots again, away from ethics, towards bodies and health. That's where the weight comment enters.
Because look at me, I'm still fat.
You see the contradiction straight away. It's healthier, but look at me, I'm still fat. Sorry, Ricky. I mean, I think you're fantastic, but
This is a false equivalence. Body size is confused with health, and also that there isn't fat in plant-based foods. There are unhealthy plant-based foods. You can eat junk food that's vegan and gain weight. You can be skinny on a meat diet. Biology comes into play, like hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, which controls how much you gain and lose weight biologically, independent from what you eat. Body size is confused with health. Diet quality, metabolism, genetics, activity, all ignored. This is not nutrition science. This is where the argument abandons ethics and gestures vaguely at health. A visual assessment is made. Body size is treated as evidence. The implication is, if someone is still overweight, their dietary choices must be unhealthy and therefore ethically irrelevant. This is a false equivalence. It collapses multiple unrelated variables into a single visible trait. Body weight is not a proxy for health, and health is not a proxy for ethics. People can gain weight on plant-based diets. People can lose weight on meat-heavy diets. People can be thin and metabolically unhealthy, hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. People can be overweight and otherwise healthy. None of that tells you how much harm a food system causes. This move confuses correlation with causation and then confuses both with moral relevance. Even if a diet were unhealthy, that would not answer the ethical question. Ethics asks what happens to others as a result of this choice. Body size answers none of that. Ask yourself, are they making a claim about outcomes or reaching for something visible to end the conversation? Because appearance is easier than analysis, what I'm doing. Once health is gestured at without clarity, the conversation reaches for authority. Long life, longevity, that's where the blue zones are introduced.
Look at me, I'm still fat. I think it's called Live to 100 Blue Zones.
Right.
And this guy is research. He's basically his whole life has been researching.
It's false.
There's certain areas around the world. He's called blue.
So here we are. That's an emotional statement. They're saying a claim is false without even proving it. So prove that someone hasn't spent their entire life researching. That could easily be Google searched. So they make claims without any proof or evidence whatsoever. It's pure emotion-based rhetoric, not logical, not reasonable, not ethical. Data is welcomed briefly and then undermined when it challenges the narrative. This is where evidence briefly enters the room, but only on probation.
I think it's called live to 100 blue zones.
Right.
And this guy is research. It's basically his whole life has been researching.
It's false.
There's certain areas around the world, he's called blue zones, right? Where people live to like 95, 98, 100, right? And he looked at what they had in common. And it was usually a vegan diet, right?
Usually a vegan diet.
Or an organic diet.
What's an organic diet?
I'll tell you what isn't an organic diet.
So they don't even know what an organic diet is, but they're saying what an organic diet isn't. So you can't know one without knowing the other. Data is welcome briefly. Blue zones are mentioned as a signal of authority, longevity, research, people living longer lives. Data is invoked to give conversation weight. But notice the condition attached. The evidence is only acceptable as long as it doesn't challenge the conclusion. This is selective empiricism. Evidence is welcomed selectively and discarded selectively. The moment plant-heavy diets appear relevant, skepticism is activated. The research isn't engaged with, it's hedged, minimized, and preemptively dismissed. Evidence becomes something to gesture at, not something to follow. Selective empiricism is not skepticism. Skepticism questions all claims equally. Selective empiricism questions only the claims that threaten a preferred narrative. It's not a method, it's a filter. When evidence is used as decoration rather than constraint, conclusions are already decided. Ask yourself, are they open to being corrected by data or only using data to sound credible? Because those are very different relationships to truth. Once evidence starts to feel inconvenient, the argument doesn't abandon it outright, it redefines it. That's where the organic diet confusion begins.
And that's a fake hot
Organic diet.
What's an organic diet?
I'll tell you what isn't an organic diet, and that's a fake hot dog.
Because a bad vegan diet is worse
Yes.
than a non-vegan
Because
organic
of all the
diet.
process and all
Yeah.
that.
So organic, vegan, healthy, treated as the same thing. They aren't. Confusion isn't critique. They don't even know what organic is. They admit that they're confused. This is where definitions start to blur. Terms that describe different things are treated as interchangeable. Organic, vegan, healthy. They're spoken as if they occupy the same category. They don't. Organic describes how food is produced. Vegan describes what is avoided ethically, and healthy describes physiological outcomes. Confusing these categories doesn't clarify anything. It muddies the discussion. You can have organic meat. You can have non-organic vegetables. You can have healthy vegan diets. You can have unhealthy vegan diets. None of that changes the ethical question at hand. Category errors feel persuasive because they collapse complexity. Instead of asking separate questions, what causes less harm? What is nutritionally adequate? What farming practices are sustainable? Everything is thrown into one bucket and treated as a single failure. That isn't analysis, it's conflation. When categories are confused, accountability disappears. Ask yourself, are they clarifying distinctions or relying on confusion to move the argument along? Because clarity is dangerous to weak positions. Once definitions are blurred, the argument pivots again, this time to processing, and the goalpost moves.
Organic diet.
What's an organic?
All these things.
I mean, they've all got 1,000 ingredients in it. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
So the very thing they were extolling the virtues of earlier, they've both just said they've got 1,000 ingredients.
And they've taken out all the goodness. But, you're not eating meat, but...
Oh, well, it's healthier, it's plant-based or it's vegan. That's just brainwashing.
So...
Actually, what they're doing is brainwashing. The argument shifts again. First, it's ethics, then environment, then health. When the target keeps moving, it's because the original claim didn't hold. This is where the target changes quietly, without acknowledgement. Up until now, the critique has been about harm to animals, harm to ecosystems, and ethic responsibility. Suddenly, the focus shifts. Processing, ingredients, labels. That's not refinement of the argument, it's a relocation. Moving the goalpost works by abandoning a failing line of attack and substituting a new one without admitting the change. Veganism is no longer criticized for ethics, it's criticized for processed food. But processed food is not veganism. It exists across every dietary pattern. Ultra-processed meat products exist. Ultra-processed dairy exists. Ultra-processed everything exists. Processing is a property of modern food systems, not moral verdict on ethical choices. Moving the goalpost prevents resolution. Each time the claim weakens, the criteria changes. Ethics becomes impossible to satisfy, not because it's flawed, but because the rules keep shifting. If veganism reduces harm, the argument pivots to health. If health is tested, the argument pivots to processing. If processing is addressed, something else will follow. This isn't inquiry, it's evasion. Ask yourself, are they following a question to its conclusion or abandoning it the moment it becomes uncomfortable? Because truth withstands scrutiny, narratives require motion. Once processing becomes the new focus, the conversation leans on lifestyle instead of diet, movement, community, activity. That's where the Blue Zone lifestyle explanation appears.
All these things.
I
Right?
mean, they've all got a
With diet,
They usually live on sort of hilly terrain. It's called steepness. And so the more hills and stairs you have to go up every day, that's really good for you. They don't go to the gym, these people. They haven't got gyms, right?
Yeah.
But they grow their own food, they cook their own thing. They're doing something all the time, right? They drink, you know, they sit out and they drink wine, but they dance for 2 hours as well. They walk to.
So, lifestyle factors are used to erase dietary patterns instead of contextualizing them. That's not how causality works. This is where explanation is replaced with dilution. Diet stops being examined on its own terms. Movement is introduced. Community, hills, dancing, and walking. All of these things matter, none of them negate diet. Context stripping works by listing contributing factors and then using their existence to erase one factor entirely. But causation is not exclusive. Multiple factors can contribute without canceling each other out. Multiple things can be true at the same time. They're using binary fallacies as in 1-0 when everything's a spectrum. Multiple things can be true at the same time. Multiple things can be true at the same time. The presence of activity does not mean diet is irrelevant. The presence of community does not mean food choices don't matter. Removing diet from the picture is not nuance, it's subtraction. Context stripping pretends to add complexity while actually removing accountability. Instead of asking how do these factors interact, it asks which factors can we ignore. This isn't analysis, it's deflection. Ethics depends on understanding contribution, not erasing it. Ask yourself, are they integrating multiple causes or using them to make one inconvenient cause disappear? Because integration clarifies, erasure obscures. Once diet has been stripped of relevance, the argument escalates. The claim isn't just that diet is complex, it's that the data itself is wrong. That's where the Blue Zone's denial disappears without any corroborating evidence. Blue Zones aren't plant-based, cherry picking.
with diet,
This is the big kicker. Most of the Blue Zone areas are not plant-based anyway.
if you actually
They don't show the stats or this data, they're just making a falsifiable claim without proving their point. Predominantly plant-based is reframed as non-vegan to dismiss the pattern entirely. That's misrepresentation, not refutation. This is where skepticism turns selective. The claim shifts from nuance to denial. The argument is no longer diet is one factor among many. It becomes the dietary pattern doesn't exist. This is empirical cherry picking. Broad patterns are dismissed by isolating exceptions. Blue Zone diets are not described as vegan. They never were. They're described as predominantly plant-based with small amounts of animal product. That distinction matters. They're completely strawmanning the entire argument. Cherry picking works by treating not perfect as claimed as not relevant as all. If meat appears anywhere, the entire pattern is declared invalid. But this logic would erase almost every epidemiological finding. No population eats one thing exclusively. Patterns are statistical, not ideological. Empirical cherry picking confuses description with endorsement. Saying a diet is plant heavy is not the same as saying it is plant exclusive. They don't even know the difference. Dismissing data because it isn't absolute is another form of absolutism, and absolutism is incompatible with population science. Ask yourself, are they engaging with the pattern as it exists or rejecting it because it doesn't match a caricature? Because rejecting patterns is a reliable way to avoid conclusions. Once population data is destabilized, the argument retreats into story, not statistics, not outcomes, anecdote. That's where the personal story enters.
This is the big kicker. Most of the Blue Zone areas.
About 12 years ago, part of the Hindu ceremony after they pass away, you have their photo up, and in front of the photo, you put stuff that they liked.
Yeah,
so this
yeah.
my mum decided for him. It's a big bowl of deep fried mutton curry, right? A bottle of Jack Daniels and 20 Benson. And then they go, it was a heart attack. I've got
That's great. I love that.
How?
Why would meat, the thing we've eaten since the beginning of our time,
Oh, another fallacy, another misrepresentation of history. Stories replace statistics, emotional but not evidentiary. This is where population gives way to story. A personal experience is introduced as if it carries the same weight as evidence. The shift is subtle. The tone becomes intimate, relatable, human. And that's precisely why it works. Anecdotes feel convincing because they are concrete. But concreteness is not the same as representativeness. One person's outcome does not invalidate population level trends. A story can explain an experience, it cannot establish causation. Using anecdote to counter data is not balance, it's substitution. Anecdotal override works by emotional authority. It bypasses analysis by appealing to familiarity. But ethics and health are not determined by who tells the better story, they are determined by aggregate outcomes. When stories replace statistics, conclusions drift towards comfort, not accuracy. Ask yourself, are they offering a story to add texture or replace inconvenient data? Because stories should illuminate, not erase it. Once evidence has been replaced with anecdote, the final justification appears, not scientific, not ethical, historical. That's where the appeal to tradition enters. We've eaten meat forever, so it's okay. This is absolutism and is a naturalistic fallacy. So this is no different than saying slavery is okay because it's been done for so long. It's literally no different than justifying like slavery or genital mutilation simply because it's traditions, because they've done it forever.
12 years ago,
why would meat, the thing we've eaten since the beginning of our time, cause a heart attack, right? Just saying, putting that.
Humans have also died young, forever. History explains behavior, it doesn't justify it. This is the final philosophical retreat. When evidence, ethics, and proportionality fail, history is invoked. The claim is simple: humans have always eaten meat, and the implication follows, therefore eating meat must be acceptable. This is the naturalistic fallacy. It assumes that what has happened must ought to happen again. But history explains behavior, it does not justify it. Humans have always experienced disease. Humans have always lived short lives. Humans have always caused harm. None of those facts are arguments for preserving those conditions. Tradition describes constraint. Ethics evaluates choice. The appeal to history avoids the present. It treats past necessity as permanent permission. But the ethical question changes when options change. What may have been unavoidable in the past does not remain justified when alternatives exist. Ethics begins when necessity ends. Ask yourself, are they explaining why something once happened or claiming that it must continue regardless of consequences? Because inevitability and justification are not the same thing. Once tradition has been exhausted, the argument quietly reveals its incentive. Not ethics, not evidence, but branding. That's where the sales pitch begins.
Why would meat, heart disease,
We've got whiskey
heart disease?
We've got whiskey coming out.
Whiskey coming out.
Recently, I've launched a non-judgmental online community for like-minded people who want a more ancestral, common sense approach to food and life.
There is nothing common sense about tradition as tradition. And here's the tell. After dismissing studies and nuance, we get a paid community. Certainty sells, complexity doesn't. This is where the argument resolves, not with evidence, not with ethics, but with an offer. A community is introduced, a lifestyle, guidance, clarity, results. The tone shifts again, confident, certain, settled. This is incentive bias becoming visible. Throughout the discussion, complexity was treated as confusion. They don't even know the difference between organic. Nuance was dismissed. Studies were waved away as argument for argument's sake. And now we see why. Simplicity sells. Certainty sells. Doubt does not. When a conclusion is tied to a product, skepticism must increase, not decrease, because the goal is no longer understanding, it's conversion. Incentive bias explains the structure of the entire argument, why absolutism keeps appearing, why gradients are erased, and why reduction is treated as meaningless. Ethical complexity interferes with marketing. If harm exists on a spectrum, then no single lifestyle can be sold as an answer. So the spectrum is flattened, ethics is mocked, and certainty is packaged. Ask yourself, are they inviting you to think or inviting you to join a cult? Because those are very different invitations. This video does not dismantle vegan ethics, it avoids them by replacing proportional reasoning with purity tests and ethical inquiry with identity. The least scientific thing I've ever analyzed.